Yesterday I had the luck of being able to do a lecture that I was pretty confident most people would want to hear. So this morning is a little bit trickier because you possibly have seen the fact that I was co-author with Kiko Matsumoto of the book Extraordinary Vessels. So we did a pretty good job documenting the historical development of them and describing some modern clinical uses from Japan and Germany. And then if you've seen in Hara Diagnosis, you'll see we did all kinds of interesting discussions and speculations on the nature and origin of the extraordinary vessels, and that was really a little bit different. And also described extensively their use in Dr. Manika's system, another Japanese system. And then in the book Chasing the Dragon's Tail, we extend that further. Much more extensive discussion of Dr. Manika's treatment system, use of the extraordinary vessels, his ideas about the nature of the extraordinary vessels. And then in Understanding Acupuncture, I wrote even more about it, where I talk about how there are problems of mistranslation from the Chinese, which seem to be which are commonly represented in the modern European and Western literature, because textbooks that describe and use these mistranslations are the standard textbooks at all the schools. So what should I cover today? Well, last year I was asked by a fellow in Germany who was the editor for a German chiropractor TCM magazine, would I write a piece about extraordinary vessels and embryology, which is really interesting to talk about. So I did, because it gave me an opportunity to think about things differently after 20 years of not writing about it. So this morning it's a little bit of a hodgepodge of all of those things. I want you to understand something about the nature of practice and history, and then at the end I'm just going to wildly speculate, because I think some of these ideas are interesting. So I'm hoping what you'll get out of it is at least a different way of thinking about what might the extraordinary vessels be, to break your assumptions that you actually think you know what they are, because I don't think anybody really does. I think they're a really seriously much more unclear system than the 12 meridians. Not that we really know what they are, but certainly the extraordinary vessels represent something much more vague and unclear. Okay, so anyway, that's what I'm going to try to do today, which will make me maybe not quite so popular as yesterday morning, because I'm not sure if you want your understanding to be disassembled quite like that. Anyway, extraordinary vessels, we have this European TCM model. This is really, really popular. This is the standard in all the textbooks in the schools, okay? Needling left and right, female, right, male, and so on, based upon TCM patterns and symptoms. And then in China, they do also treating them, but they've got slightly different language and so on. They do things a bit differently than you'll tend to see in the Western textbooks. And then you go to Japan, where extraordinary vessels are used extensively and by some practitioners exclusively. So in these first two systems, we're talking about needling with dochi. Regular needling with dochi. Here we're talking about needling very shallowly and applying something which creates a tiny electrical bias. It's called the ion pumping cords. Kind of sets up a polarity between the points. And then as a similar model, we have this fellow here using the extraordinary vessels, also using a kind of electrical bias and magnetic bias, using special magnets to adjust the spine. And in these two systems, we're not so much, it's not related to familiar patterns of diagnosis that we have in TCM, more a kind of a conceptual understanding of the body and the fact that if you treat these 8 points, you can adjust the structure of the body. Okay? And then we've got these other systems. This is a system I also use. We'll literally be using the 4 pairs of points with zinc and copper pellets or needles, specifically only to target symptoms. No patterns of diagnosis, just, oh, you've got a pain over here, let's do this. And then another system, also from Germany, which is quite parallel to the Toyari system, also using zinc copper needles on the 4 pairs of points, specifically only to relieve symptoms or clusters of symptoms. So you can see in the modern period, there's lots of different ways of using the extraordinary vessels. And you can imagine behind that, there's a lot of different conceptual understanding of what they might be. So let's go back to the beginning and see what we can say about them. We have a number of descriptions in the Neijing. I'm just going to give you a few samples here about the extraordinary vessels. The Changmai is the ocean of yin, yang organs, the 12 channels, passes blood to the organs, etc. Also the ocean of the 12 channels. This is different chapters in the Ling Shu. Then we have the ocean is the Changmai is the ocean of blood, and the big law of Shao Yin, whatever that is not so clear. The Qi, as an example from chapter 21 of the Ling Shu, if the Qi of Yin Chao is excess, you have unable to open, so somnolence, I believe. And if the Qi of the Yang Chao is excess, you have insomnia. Can't close your eyes. So we have some ideas about, they seem to be something really important. We have these discussions in the Ling Shu, and we get some hint about symptomatology here. For example, this is a sample of symptomatology. There's not really a coherent description in the Ling Shu. For example, the Ling Shu has 3 different descriptions on the pathway of the Changmai, which are actually quite contradictory, but in the modern period, we all just take them as 3 different branches of the same thing. That's our way to resolve the fact that these are contradictory statements. So, here's another passage from the Ling Shu, suggesting that the extraordinary vessels, especially the Renmai and the Changmai, seem to be associated with hormonal changes, developmental changes, and so on. This is quite commonly quoted in much of the modern literature in, I think, probably China and certainly in Western countries. But my teachers in Japan never talk about this stuff because they don't know what to do with it. But anyway, so this is another kind of idea suggesting maybe the extraordinary vessels are associated with developmental processes. Now we have in the Nanjing something a little bit more coherent. We get for the first time the term extraordinary vessels is Qijing Bamai, and this term is introduced in the Nanjing. And in the Neijing, we don't have any real systematic theory. It's a hodgepodge of ideas, different hints at pathway descriptions or suggestions of pathway locations, hints at symptomatology. There's no coherent theories of just a few ideas thrown out. In the Nanjing, you tend to see something a little bit more systematic, which is a characteristic of the Nanjing. They try to describe things more systematically. So, first of all, the extraordinary vessels are not related to the 12 meridians. They're not touched by the flow of the 12 meridians, chapter 27. And here's a description of how they relate to each other when the 12 meridians are full to overflowing, not full with bad stuff, 邪气, but they're just overflowing. The overflow goes down into the systems of ditches and dikes, which is the extraordinary vessels. And they were using the analogy of the big rivers in China when they would flood. In the Han Dynasty, they built the systems of ditches and dikes to control the flooding, right, which allowed society to progress significantly. And they had the idea that the extraordinary vessels were something like that, systems of ditches and dikes to control the flooding of the major rivers. And of course, the rivers are here and the systems of ditches and dikes are down here, so the water doesn't flow uphill, so therefore they say it doesn't return. Okay? And then you also get some hints again. I gave you the example from the Ling Shu about symptomatology of the Yin Chao, Yang Chao. Here we have something completely different. Very different description, not to do with sleepiness, but laxness and looseness of yin and yang sides of the body. Well, you could look at that and you could come up with lots of ideas about how to interpret that. Well, what do you mean by laxness and looseness of the, it's tight here and loose here, or is it tight here and loose here, or vice versa? We can imagine lots of different ideas about this. we have a kind of an idea that the extraordinary vessels are a sort of storage system to do with the spilling over from the 12 meridians, and we get more clear, more systematic descriptions of the symptomatology. Here we have something that seems somewhat familiar. Yang Wei disease is physical and emotional suffering of cold and heat. Yin Wei Mai, you have physical and emotional suffering with heart pain. Yin Wei Mai and heart pain. That's the first time we hear this described. So this is somewhat familiar based upon our current thinking about the extraordinary vessels. And yin and yang cannot balance. Emotions will be thinking too much. So both Yin Wei Mai and Yang Wei Mai are both associated with emotional problems, lack of self-control. Okay, this is the thinking of the Nanjing. So they're coming up with something that's looking a little bit more systematic, but it's still not really a coherent model. It's more coherent than what you find in the Neijing. After that, there's smatterings of ideas. We don't really get any kind of systematic descriptions of the extraordinary vessels. You get a few statements dotted in the literature here and there. For example, in the Meijing, this idea that the Chengmai and the Dumai are related to each other, related to the 12 meridians. Wang Bing also taking this idea a little bit further and talking about this kind of one source, and that kind of gives rise to the Dumai, the Renmai, the Chengmai. So somehow we have this idea emerging which mirrors the descriptions of the Chengmai in the Neijing, that the Chengmai is the ocean of this and the ocean of that. It somehow seems important to the functioning of all of the different systems of the Zhengfu, the blood, the 12 meridians, and so on. Here we see it stated slightly differently, but the same kind of idea. They seem to be foundational systems, but not really clear what they are. And then in 1437, we get great clarity, if you will. What they do is they describe 8 treatment points based upon something that was described several centuries, like 150 odd years earlier. This textbook, the Genjing Zhinan, described, wow, man, look what happens if you needle small intestine 3 and bladder 62, you can treat this huge long list of symptoms. Wow. And if you do spleen 4 and pericardium 6, this great list of symptoms, these things get better. No discussion of the extraordinary vessels. It's just some discovery that these 4 pairs of points were really powerful and were really good for complex lists of symptoms with no theoretical description at all. Okay? So the Zhenju Dachuan took this pairing of the extraordinary vessels and combined them and labeled them in association to the extraordinary vessels as we are most familiar with them, right, in the following manner. It made this pairing. Before 1437, the extraordinary vessels were never paired like this. Nobody had done anything like that. And before 1437, there was no clear treatment described of the extraordinary vessels. You get a hint of an idea, but no systematic description of treatment. So we have the pairing of these points associated with the extraordinary vessels, associated with long lists of symptoms. Okay? So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the idea that it's not till much, much later that these 8 treatment points were developed and paired up like this, or that the extra vessels were even paired like this, and not till that time. But they did something also very interesting in the Zhenju Dachuan. It introduces the extraordinary vessels in relation to the Qijing Bamai, in relation to the magic square and the 8 trigrams in the later heaven sequence, so that they could then describe a system of biorhythmic open points called the Lingui Bafa. So the systems of the systems of open points started, I believe, in the 12th century. You get a system of open points associated with a cycle in 10 days using the 5-phase points and the source points. And then in the 1437, we see the introduction of a system of open points associated with the extraordinary vessels, where those 8 treatment points become active and then close down again, and then active and close down again in a sequence over 60 days. That's the cycle called the Lingue Barfa. Okay? So here's the association. Each of the points is associated with a trigram and a number in the magic square setup. Okay? If you're unfamiliar with the magic square setup, if you go horizontally on any of these lines, it always adds up to 15. If you go vertically, it adds up to 15, and if you cut across, it adds up to 15. That's the magic square. And they put the middle one associated with kidney 6. So it's a very complex system. It took a couple more centuries to work out the details so that other people could reproduce this system. But it's a system that's associated with the 5-phase and yin-yang properties associated with the stem and branch cycles and the labeling of time according to hourly and daily patterns of rhythmic change of time. And the yin and yang sequences and 5-phase associations of the stems and branches are associated with numbers. They have these associated numbers. And then for any time on any day, you take the numbers associated with the time of the hour. So each hour has a stem and a branch time associated with it, and properties associated with the stems and branches, and therefore 2 numbers associated with them. And each day the same. And you take these 4 numbers, you add them up, and you divide by 9 or 6, depending upon whether it's a yin day or a yang day. And the number that's left over is then seen as a correspondence to one of these, and that's the open point. It's a little bit more elaborate than that, but it's really weird. It comes totally out of the blue. We don't know where it comes from. It's not, they don't tell you what to do with it. They just say, wow, look at this. Okay, I'm sure some of you have come across this, and we all struggle to try to find ways of using it. But the 8 treatment points in the Genju Dachuan, you get lists of symptoms for these 8 treatment points. Just do this when you see these symptoms, and then you get this very strange system of a 60-day cycle of opening and closing of these 8 treatment points in a rhythmic pattern. So the Genju Dachuan also tells us that these points are especially target these areas here, the Yin Wei Chung Mai, heart, chest, and stomach, the Yang Chao Du Mai, nose, eyes, ears, back, neck, shoulders, and so on. So they give us a little bit of a hint about ways of selecting the points. Yang Wei Dai Mai. This should be rather familiar to you in terms of the pathways of the extraordinary vessels. And Yin Chao Ren Mai. That's not what. After this now becomes standard doctrine. In 1529, the Genju Jueying, which is another text similar in nature to the Genju Dachuan, which is a text that compiles other ideas and some novel ideas. This is the tendency in the Ming Dynasty, is to write these texts where they're sort of collecting lots of different people's ideas. Okay, in the Genju Jueying, it said, wow, well, this treatments of the 8 extraordinary vessels is really good. So it really elaborates on it and adds much more symptomatic description of the 8 treatment points, and then makes a statement that the needling these 8 treatment points is really cool, because it's like, if you think about it, the effect is so large, it's like going hunting for a rabbit in a field using a net the size of the field. You always get it. Okay, that's their idea. It's like, wow, this is really huge. The Genju Dachuan took this idea and ran even further with it. So you can see an evolution of these 8 treatment points becoming much more incorporated into standard practice, and much larger elaboration of the ways of using the extraordinary vessels. And this is a very important text because there's some reasons to suppose that some of the ideas in here are foundational for a lot of modern practice. okay? But anyway, it took a lot of really, we'll see when we look at the treatments and the ideas of symptoms and treatments associated with the extraordinary vessels, that the Genju Dachang really gives really super long lists of symptoms that you can treat using these pairs of points. Really long lists. All of this stuff about the different lists and the long lists are all translated in the book Extraordinary Vessels. So you can go and have a look at them there. But it also makes some very interesting statements. It introduces another novel idea. You have to examine the right and left, upper and lower parts of the body. Feel and palpate the body to feel something with your hands, and then do exercises and take the disease away with the 8 points. Well, certainly in modern practice in Japan, where they palpate the body a lot for diagnosis and examine the condition of the body to determine the patterns of disturbance in the body, and then use the extraordinary vessels according to the patterns of asymmetry in the musculature and skeletal system, that kind of matches that statement. And that's one of the ways that the extraordinary vessels are used in the system, like I mentioned earlier, the system from Dr. Manica and Mr. Ito, using the eight extraordinary vessel treatment points with polarity agents to adjust the structural asymmetries in the body. And also make the upper and lower parts connect. Okay, if I needle here and I needle here, I'm connecting the upper and lower parts in some way. Well, actually, in one of the treatment systems I mentioned, you actually attach wires between the needles. That really connects upper and lower parts. But that's just one way of doing it. But anyway, this is, you start to see a description of the extraordinary vessels that's related to the physical structure of the body. And I'm going to be proposing some ideas related to polarities in the body associated with the physical structure up and down, left and right, front and back. Okay, we'll come back and when I get into my speculations later. Also, the Genju Dachang has another couple of broad statements. It says the Yang extraordinary vessels are mostly associated with musculoskeletal problems. That's mostly what you use them for. Okay? Whereas the Yin extraordinary vessels are mostly associated with stuff inside the body, the different organ systems inside the body. I think this is somewhat familiar for most of us. Okay. Then we have Li Shijian. I put him separately here. He was writing just before the last text, the Genju Dachang. Li Shijian wrote the only book on the extraordinary vessels that we know of in the historical literature, in the medical historical literature. There were other descriptions in, for example, the Neidan, the self-cultivation literature, that also just talk about the extraordinary vessels. But in the medical text, medical tradition, that's the only text that we know of about the extraordinary vessels, okay? And if you're familiar with the work of Li Shijian, you know he was really a kind of a scholar. He really liked to compile lots of ideas. Okay? So this was written after he'd written his great herbal treatise, and he doesn't describe the 8 treatment points whatsoever. Nada, nothing. He quotes the Genju Juying, which is one of those 3 books in the Ming Dynasty, the one from 1529, that talks extensively about the 8 treatment points. He quotes extensively from the book, but never mentions the 8 treatment points, simply refused to acknowledge them. Okay, so, but then Li Shijian is the one that gives us the most comprehensive description on the pathways of the extraordinary vessels, the symptomatology of the extraordinary vessels, etc. And yet he never used the 8 treatment points, which is what most of us use when we treat the extraordinary vessels. So it raises these curious questions that I don't like to ask about, do those 8 treatment points actually do the things that he says the extraordinary vessels say they're supposed to do? If you treat them, are you affecting that stuff? Does it work like that? Or are those 8 treatment points better used when you see symptomatology as described, for example, by the text that described the 8 treatment points? You understand that's a difficult question, because everybody loves to quote from Leishagen. We're very fortunate in that Charles Chase, with assistance of Mikishima, did a very, very good translation of this text, the Chijingba Maigao. He started work on that after I met him in Japan a bunch of years ago. We were studying together, talking about, as we usually do, shooting the breeze. And I said to him, God, nobody's ever translated the Chijingba Maigao. Somebody should do it. It's a really cool book. But I'm not an herbalist, so I wouldn't want to go anywhere near anything like that. It's too difficult for me. And he says, oh, I'll have a look at it. That sounds really interesting. And this was translated as a result of that discussion. I was very happy. He did a great job translating it as well. So, extraordinary vessels, not controlled by the 12 meridians, nor are they arranged in interior-exterior combinations. Mostly, he liked the Nanjing model, the Nanjing description. The extraordinary vessels are like these reservoirs, if you will, for the stuff that spills over. It just sort of stores this extra stuff for you. I remember those of you in my lecture yesterday, when I say stuff, that's a kind of unofficial translation for chi. Okay, remember that? There are a number of scholars that have translated chi as stuff. So don't forget, that's kind of half a joke. Anyway, the main channels are irrigation ditches. The extraordinary vessels are like lakes and marshes. So he's using this model extensively for the extraordinary vessels. And this is him. This is a quote from him. Discussion of the extraordinary vessels scattered throughout the masses of medical texts are sketchy or incomplete. This is Leishagen talking. He thought, okay, it's not a really very clear system, is it? However, you need to understand the extraordinary vessels if you want to be a really good clinician. Okay, that's a little bit like read my book, buy my book message, isn't it? If aspiring transcendents are not aware of the more comprehensive theories of the extraordinary vessels, it will be difficult for them. So this statement here is about the extraordinary vessels were described in the self-cultivation literature. That's what this term aspiring transcendents refers to. Students of self-cultivation use the extraordinary vessels. Those of you who have been studying, for example, in Qigong, you'll have probably had teachers that talk about doing different exercises and procedures to open up or do something to the different extraordinary vessels, right? We're familiar with this. So Leishagen's talking in part about this, but then he also says, in terms of the medical system that you need to, there's another statement, I seem to have edited it out. The next sentence says, you also, in the practice of medicine, you need to know about the extraordinary vessels. And then he says, he's tried to capture these different traditions of thinking from the self-cultivation literature and the tiny snippets of confusing literature that you find dotted around in the historical medical literature. He's trying to make a comprehensive story out of both of those traditions. Okay? And Leishagen did something different. He paired the extraordinary vessels in ways that also kind of make more sense. The Weimeier paired, the Chowmeier paired, Ren and Dua paired, Chung and Dai are somehow paired. They seem too different to be pairable, but it's okay. Not our normal ways of thinking about them. So you can see immediately that he's coming up with a different conceptual framework and understanding of the extraordinary vessels than the acupuncture literature had previously described. Okay. Here's examples of symptomatology. The yang wei arises at the meeting. When the intersection of the yin travels upwards, they constitute a binding network of the entire body. So we see here this idea that the Weimeier are associated with binding and holding things together. Okay? And also the yang Weimeier governs the exterior, govern the interior. This is a novel idea. We don't see that quite articulated like this in the acupuncture literature. We see it more articulated. As I said, Li Shijian's got these different ideas. He introduced us for the first time that this is the first statement about the Du-Mai is the ocean of Yang, whereas the Renmai is the ocean of Yin. He introduced this idea. That doesn't pre-exist 1570 something. Okay. Let me see. I'll let you just read that. The extraordinary vessels. If you really understand them, you can do a much better medical practice, and you're able to become the transcendent that can do these amazing things if you practiced. Okay, so I'm not going to dwell on this because you're better off buying that book and reading it. It's got a lot of detail and lots of explanations. This is a passage that I'm adding in. It's not quite the same translation that Chip did when he translated this text, but the Chinese permits you, sometimes it's like, well, you could make it could be like this, sometimes there's a lot of flexibility in the interpretation, so long as you've applied the proper grammatical rules, you've put it in the context of what they're discussing, and you've translated all the characters, you often find there's room for understanding something a little differently. So my translation here is slightly different than the way Chip rendered it, but the meaning is very, very similar. So this is in a discussion in Li Shijian where he's talking about the origin of the extraordinary vessels, and he makes this statement: everybody has them. They belong to the yin shen. I don't really know what yin shen means, so don't ask, okay? This is the important statement. They close and do not open. Only the sages, here Chip translated it as the transcendents, those who are doing these self-cultivation practices. Only the transcendents can push them open with yang qi. Therefore, by this means, they're able to grasp the Tao. That was the purpose of doing these self-cultivation processes. You become a more enlightened person so you can understand and follow the Tao better, right? And then there's this other stuff, the 8 vessels of the root of the before heaven, Tao, the beginning of the same stuff we saw from the Maijing and also from Wang Bing, in his edition of the Su Wen. But I'm going to come back to this statement here about they close and do not open. This suggests that at some point the extraordinary vessels were open, and then at some point they stopped being open, and you have to do something to make them active again, because they're closed. They aren't doing anything until you're practicing these transcendent techniques to open them again. It suggests this language here also, it may be this is why Li Shijian rejected the notion of you could needle kidney 6 and lung 7 and suddenly the Yin Cha Renmai is open. Oof. Perhaps he thought, well, that doesn't make any sense. You've got to do something a bit more than just stick a needle here and here to make them open, because they're closed. They aren't doing anything. Certainly, it's a reasonable interpretation of what he says here, okay? So that's a kind of a background of a muddling of ideas. My purpose is to confuse you slightly, because we go to school and we learn things, and sometimes we don't have opportunity to question what we learn in school, so we have to kind of accept it. And I have seen for 30 years now, there's a kind of a dogma about the extraordinary vessels that's found its way into the Western literature, which doesn't make a lot of sense if you read Chinese. Okay, so I'm kind of trying to undermine that a little bit so that we can think a bit more flexibly about the extraordinary vessels. So anyway, thinking about theories of the extraordinary vessels, this is one system. There's a hint that the Renmai and the Chongmai in particular are associated with these important 7 and 8 year cycles. And for sure, there are practitioners that have figured out how to use these ideas in clinical practice. And that's very important. And my teachers don't do anything with this idea in Japan, those I've studied with at least, but there are certainly some useful ideas associated with this. They act like oceans, which means they're kind of reservoirs, if you will. The Nanjing says it a little differently. The Lingshu, the Chongmai is the ocean of the 12 channels, the Zhangfu and the ocean of blood, and the Qijing Baomaigao, the Renmai and Dumai, the oceans of yin and yang. And there's some statements in especially this discussion in here, in the Lingshu, where it talks about the Renmai and the Chongmai in relation to developmental processes, whether you have a mustache or not. There's some hints that there is extraordinary vessels are related to developmental and functional processes, but they act as a backup storage system. That's the Nanjing model. They're sort of spilling over, but then there's no treatment given, as you'll see. It's very unclear. You have this idea that the extraordinary vessels are very important in the contemplative traditions. So the extraordinary vessels are linked to certain Taoist practice methods. Li Shizhen was the first medical author to pick up on this and to describe what to do about this. I'll talk very briefly about treatments from different traditions, different texts and so on. And some of the ideas that he described in his book, which were not described in the acupuncture literature, have now found their way as routine into the acupuncture literature, though I wonder whether they should be so readily associated. Then there's another way of thinking about the extraordinary vessels from a theoretical point of view, and that is, there's no theory. The 8 treatment points did not come with any theory. It was really, really simple. If you see a bunch of symptoms from this list, needle the points. That's it. Purely, totally symptomatic treatment method. Not related to any of those beautiful theories that start to emerge in the Suwen and Lingshu and Nanjing, etc. Not related. Probably why Li Shizhen didn't include one other reason for why Li Shizhen didn't talk about the extra 8 treatment points, because they were purely symptomatic treatments. Okay? And very popular, increasingly popular as you come into the modern period. So, what we can say, that I think that we can say that's clear about the extraordinary vessels, is they are not related to the 5 phases. They are not described as having a circulation. Now, this is a point of disagreement with some of the modern European Western TCM literature, which does describe the extraordinary vessels as having a circulation. And we'll come back to that, okay? But I can tell you with absolute certainty, there is no historical text that anyone that I know or that I have been able to find that talks about a circulation of any kind in the extraordinary vessels, unless you're involved in doing this contemplative practice. Okay? We'll come back to this. They're not related to the 5 shu points, the command points and so on. And they do not have interior-exterior relationships. So what we can say about them is these negatives, they're not doing this stuff, okay? They don't have a close relationship to the Zhangfu, and so not so closely tied to the functional systems inside the body. There is huge variation in their description. We're going to look at, I'm going to give you a quick summary of the pathways of the extraordinary vessels, and I think it should be readily clear that historically authors have not agreed on where these things are. There's a lot of disagreement, much more than you would imagine from reading the modern textbooks. Until 1437, there was no real systematic treatment. And treatment was based on symptoms. So these things are relatively clear. There is a modern tendency in Western literature to associate the extraordinary vessels with Jing. So here's a couple of quotes. I've written about this. If you look in Understanding Acupuncture at the end of chapter 2, there's in the text and then in a couple of the footnotes for the endnotes for the chapter, we have a discussion of this. Here's Machocha's statement about the extraordinary vessels that contain essence, which is stored in they circulate essence around the body. And then we have another one here, Qingmai interlink for the production, circulation, discharge, and regeneration of the essence. Then there's also, as a parallel to that, some practitioners associate the extraordinary vessels, when they don't talk about Jing, they talk about this yuan qi and circulation of this yuan qi. Yuan qi is most concentrated in the curious meridians. The extraordinary vessels function on a deep fundamental level, that they are the carriers of yuan qi, or ancestral energy. When we were writing the book Extraordinary Vessels in the mid-1980s, at the time we were hearing some people in the US saying, oh, the extra vessels circulate Jing Qi, or they do this, or they do that. So Kiko and I had all these Chinese texts. I'd done my studies of Chinese, and I was also able to read Chinese at the time. I can't do it very well now. So we sat down with all the major Chinese texts. We had reference text that tells you which books talk about the extraordinary vessels and which ones don't, so we knew where to look. We got hold of all of the texts that describe the extraordinary vessels, and we couldn't find a single statement to support any of that. Other than the previous thing, there's nothing in the historical literature that talks about the extraordinary vessels and Jing at all, anywhere. Okay, we couldn't find anything. Okay, so we did an extensive search for this. And then and when we published our book, not talking about these associations, but at the same time not talking about what other people were saying about them, we kind of ignored it. We thought the problem had gone away, and then it reappeared again in the mid-1990s. I was at a lecture in California, and my lecture topic was the extraordinary vessels, and I was going to teach how to do treatments for the rest of the day. And the person lecturing me for 5 minutes at the beginning of the symposium, his lecture was, oh, don't treat the extraordinary vessels. It'll make you prematurely age and damage your Jing. Which I thought, so I got really teed off at that, and I spent the next 5 minutes complaining about what crap that was. Anyway, I didn't have many people attend my workshop after that. But anyway, there's also this popular idea about you can cause damage to somebody by treating the extraordinary vessels. Okay, because it might damage your Jing. Well, in the book Understanding Acupuncture, we raise the following question. If that were true, don't you think in China, where especially there's been this kind of obsession for men to protect their Jing and not prematurely age, right? Don't you think they would have said something about it in the Chinese literature if in fact the extraordinary vessels was going to damage your Jing? Absolutely not. There's nothing. It's not there. Okay? It's a kind of a Western paranoia. Okay? Based upon a mistranslation. We'll come to the mistranslation part. So, there's no circulation of any kind in the extraordinary vessels. And I've had a lot of discussion with Chip Chase about this, who I consider to be one of the Western leading experts on the extraordinary vessels because of the work that he had to do his translation of the Qi Jing Bao Mai Gao. He has a very, very extensive understanding and knowledge and background, okay? So we've had lots of dinners together talking about this, and I've said, well, you know, he says, well, maybe Li Shizheng kind of hinted that the extraordinary vessels might be associated with yuan qi. Okay, there's a couple of statements. There's a one-liner here and a one-liner here. You could say, yeah, maybe. But we both agree that there's absolutely no historical discussion in any textbooks that either of us have found that the extraordinary vessels are associated with Jing or that there's a circulation of any kind. We've not found anything after a lot of extensive searching. And that's in not only the historical Chinese texts, but also historical Japanese texts, and also modern Chinese texts and modern Japanese texts. Okay. So, as I said, Li Shizhen does mention Yuan-Chi a couple of times, but it's, I think it stretches the point to make a very extensive statement. Therefore, the extraordinary vessels are circulating or associated with Yuan-Chi. There's some association, but the association is much more limited in Li Shizhen's texts. As I said, no modern textbooks say this. So when I have explained these ideas that we find in our modern TCM textbooks in the West to colleagues in Japan, they go, "What are you talking about? Well, who's saying that?" So where do the ideas come from? Well, I actually decided when I wrote the book Understanding Acupuncture, I should research this because I was pretty fed up by then. So I got hold of all the books that made statements like the examples I gave you, and many of our leading authors don't do a very good job with referencing. So it took me a while to figure out where they were tracking it from, because they didn't give you quotes or references or bibliographies that could lead you to where the source of information was coming from. Instead, they kind of give you the impression it's coming from China. Right? But anyway, I was eventually able to track it back to a text by Chanfro and Van Guy written in the 1970s, which looked at this passage from Ling Shu and said, therefore, and then says, yes, the Wei Qi circulates in the tendon and muscle meridians. The Ying Qi circulates in the 12 meridians, and the Jing Qi circulates in the extraordinary vessels. Well, okay, I read enough Chinese to have a look at the original Chinese in the Ling Shu and all of the commentaries I could find, and there's nothing remotely like that there. It's completely a mistranslation. Somebody just came up with a really neat idea and then said that's what it says in the Ling Shu. That's where it comes from. But that has led to a lot of really strange things, because not only are some of the descriptions in our modern textbooks misleading or just downright wrong, but as I said, you get all these strange ideas. Don't touch the extraordinary vessels. They're very bad for you. They'll damage you. They'll prematurely age you. And then the other side of it, you can needle the Yin Chao Renmai and it'll tonify your Jing. I suspect that what's needed to tonify Jing is a little bit more than 2 needles, is my guess. I don't think that's really going to do it. Okay. So I just want to get this clear there. As I said, it's not going to make me very popular. Yesterday I felt popular, and this morning I'm not feeling so popular at the moment. Because this has been bothering me for 20-odd years, and even though we've published on the topic, it just keeps rolling on. Nobody changes their texts or what they're teaching. I don't understand it. Questions? I've said a few rather challenging statements. Only a few, yes.
In the books that describe the long list of symptoms, do they specify how the 8 points are used to open or?
No, they just say needle these points.
There's no description.
I would say that the kind of clinical detail that we require in order to practice today, that we expect in our books and expect from our teachers, that level of clinical detail is usually absent in historical texts that kind of leave you to do it. It's not so clear. So it's like, should we needle lung 7 and then kidney 6, and therefore we've done the Renmai, versus if we do kidney 6 and then lung 7, therefore we've done the Yin Chao Mai, right? Sometimes that's clear, sometimes it's not so clear. Okay? But there's less detail than we would like, so it leaves room for a lot of imagination and clinical experience and trial and error to fill the gaps, right? Other questions, yes?
So you said that Li Shizhen didn't mention any points that open those extraordinary vessels?
No, he had treatments for the extraordinary vessels, but not using those 8 treatment points.
What were his treatments for the
We'll get to that. Okay, yep.
I think I know the answer to this, but there is some reference to if there is excess, then you'll be very sleepy. If there's a deficiency, you won't be able to sleep, for example.
Well, no, that's a
a
symptom in the Ling Shu associated with Yin Chao and Yang Chao. If there's a disturbance of the Yin Chao, you are sleepy all the time, and there's a disturbance of the Yang Chao, you can't sleep. Your eyes are wide open.
So
Right.
it's not that there is a symptom of a problem with the eyes, and therefore, if it's in excess, one might need to adjust the medium technique.
I think this is a modern elaboration of an earlier description. And if it works, it's great. Okay? But I don't think you'll get quite that level of detail. Other questions before I move on? Yeah.
I mean, just a comment. It seemed when you spoke earlier on about the classical texts, which referred to the extraordinary vessels as really something which was to do with the development of consciousness.
Not so clear that we can say that.
Okay, so well, that's what I kind of wondered from what you said.
Well, no, it's not so clear. Some people have imagined that, and I think that possibly comes out of from the use of the extraordinary vessels in contemplative self-cultivation
Yes.
practices.
Yes.
Like there are translations of the Qi Jing Barmai as the 8 psychic vessels.
Yes.
I've seen that. But I want to propose a totally different understanding, and one that's really rooted in the physical body. The extraordinary vessels are of the physical body, whereas the 12 meridians are a little bit more different than that.
It's kind of long shot, but I do know that in Vedic literature, for example, one of the cautions about acupuncture and the natural evolution of human consciousness towards enlightenment, it is that you can open, it's a bit like opening windows when somebody's on the cusp, but it's not quite the right time.
Okay.
So that there may well be a link between what you're suggesting and a more esoteric or spiritual kind of interpretation, because enlightenment is an embodied experience, and the subtle physical body will change as
Okay.
the state
Well,
of consciousness changes.
I'm not sure how to address this, except that there's possibly a linkage to some of what you're saying in Li Shijian's treatment descriptions. But these kind of self-cultivation practices and the implications of that and the application of these techniques to open the extraordinary vessels, I'm not sure how much you can relate any of that to needling 8 treatment points. And Li Shijian didn't think you could at all.
Yeah.
So for him, they're kind of distinct, but at the same time, he found ways of marrying them a little bit. We'll see, okay? So I haven't, in the medical tradition, outside of Li Shijian, I'm not familiar with any discussion of the extraordinary vessels remotely like that. Okay. So what I want to do is just to give you, or should we be doing a tea break? Isn't that it?
Not yet.
Well, it said 9:45.
10 o'clock, that's a great time.
Shall we do we'll go into this after the tea break, is that okay?